Welcome to the class, dear students. In this class today, we shall learn about William Wordsworth as a nature poet. William Wordsworth, the greatest romantic poet of the 19th century, England. William Wordsworth is essentially a poet of nature. His poetry is characterized by influence of nature. And in this class, let us try to briefly understand William Wordsworth as nature poet. No doubt, essentially he is a poet of nature, and throughout his life he remained an ardent worshipper of nature. He finds in nature a friend, a philosopher, guide, teacher, guardian, and nurse. William Wordsworth is influenced highly by nature. Nature has shaped him as a great poet. His spiritual being is nourished by its influence. Moreover, William Wordsworth seems to be elusively simple in his poetry. He seems very simple, but is highly philosophical if we understand the depth of his philosophy. His interest in nature is primary, and poetry is the byproduct of his interest. He finds in nature divinity. He is concerned specially with nature and man in his poetry. When we just try to understand his poetry, Wordsworth's choice is different. Wordsworth chooses simple incidents and humble people as subject for his poetry. Presents elemental simplicity of life. That is man's close communion with nature. Man can always be seen communicating with nature, in close connection with nature. He pictures humble, rustic life in his poetry. He relates nature, the individual, and human life in general in his poetry. Wordsworth seeks spiritual inspiration from nature. In this way, as he finds divinity in nature, he can be called as a pantheist, lover of nature, who finds divinity in nature. He is not at all a pagan, but some people misunderstand him as pagan and his philosophy to be paganism. It's absolutely wrong. He is purely a lover of nature. And as far as his poetry is concerned, he adores common objects in nature and sings of birds, butterflies, flowers, trees, cloud, wind, river, etc. He can be seen expressing utmost joy experienced in contemplation of simple flowers, common ordinary flowers, daffodils. We can read his poem, written at the age of 34 in 1804. I wander lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd a host of golden daffodils. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Here in this simple poem, he talks of daffodils, his experience with utmost joy in witnessing daffodils. There are some important poems of Wordsworth where nature has its relevance. In Daffodils, we have seen that he contemplates on the joy extended to him by nature. Simple flowers, simple ordinary flowers, daffodils. In another poem, To the Cuckoo, he talks of a bird, cuckoo. And in another poem, My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky, he talks of simple phenomenon in nature, that is rainbow. In his Lucy poems, he speaks of the girl brought up in nature. Nature to him is teacher. In the poem like The Tables Turned, he sees nature as teacher. And in a poem like The Solitary Reaper, he presents before us a woman in close communion with nature, singing some magical notes, working singly on the field. Sometimes serious philosophy can also be sought in poems such as Ode on Intimations of Immortality. His Tintin Abbey can be seen as sober and meditative, which traces the influence of nature upon the boy, upon growing youth, and upon the poet. Wordsworth loves his life of seclusion, and he sings of countryside life. And he sings of solitude in poems like It's a Beauteous Evening and Lines Composed upon Westminster Bridge. He basically identifies divinity with nature. Hence, he can be called as a pantheist, not pagan. He even wishes for the providence of nature to be bestowed upon man. In a simple poem, When I behold a rainbow in the sky, my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. He wishes for the divinity to be bestowed upon man. He wishes for the providence of nature to be bestowed upon man. He considers nature as teacher. In one of the poems, The Tables Turned, he speaks, Come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher. He considers nature to be the teacher. And further he says, One impulse from vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. This is how Wordsworth, as a nature poet, sees divinity, sees nature as teacher, teaching more than the sages can. And at the same time, as we observe in poem, Lucy poems, 3 years she grew in the sun and shower. Another poem, she dwelt among the untrodden ways. We see man in close communion with nature. So also in the solitary reaper, a single solitary girl working in the field. So also in resolution and independence, an old man who is a leech gatherer is pictured. In this way, Wordsworth is a poet of solitude, and he identifies divinity with nature. And when we see Wordsworth's poetic voice, Wordsworth's poetic voice is simplistic in the poems written in his early poetic career. Maybe the daffodils, to the cuckoo, the tables turned, etc. etc. And his poetic voice is sublime in poems like Ode on Intimations of Immortality and Tinton Abbey. And sometimes his poetic voice is sober, meditative, and philosophical, especially in poems written in his later poetic career. Thus, William Wordsworth is essentially a poet of nature who sings of nature, who sings of birds, flowers, and common things, who brings in common man in his poetry, who sees man in close communion, in communication with nature. Thus, Wordsworth can summarizingly can be said to be essentially poet of nature. I hope briefly you have understood Wordsworth's philosophy, Wordsworth's dealing with poetry, considering nature as teacher, nurse, guardian, philosopher, and friend. Thank you, dear students.